Hello, I'm Becca Pincus, Director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center, in partnership with the Center for Maritime Strategy, welcomes you to this afternoon's event, Deterring Russia at Sea in the High North. We have two fantastic panels lined up, and I want to thank our audience for joining us here in the room and online. I'd like to recognize our distinguished guests, Vice Admiral Lunde of the U.S. Coast Guard and Rear Admiral Remington of the Royal Navy. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to hearing from them later today. I would now like to welcome Ambassador Mark Green, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center. He formerly served as the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. While at USAID, he led the creation of the Countering Malign Kremlin Influence Development Framework, leading efforts to shore up vulnerabilities routinely targeted by the Kremlin across social media, elections, and public institutions. He is familiar with the complex challenges posed by Russia today, and I'm grateful to him for taking the time to join us today for introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Becca, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center, where we are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely independent and nonpartisan. As Becca said, I'm Mark Green, President and CEO of the Wilson Center. You know, when I was studying international relations, admittedly, some years ago, we spoke openly of a deterrence-based approach to America's role in the world. That thematic seemed to fade from view for a while. And today, of course, it has come roaring back, especially with respect to Russian efforts to restore empire through Europe and the Arctic. Sadly, conflict has been thrust again on Europe, and new generations of intercontinental missile delivery systems and stealth submarines have focused attention back on the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean may be the world's smallest ocean, and it certainly poses some formidable challenges to naval operations. Nevertheless, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard have been operating in the Arctic for years. In 1958, the U.S. submarine Nautilus became the first vessel to reach the North Pole, traveling under the ice. And that remarkable feat represented an important victory for the U.S. in its competition in those days with the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Arctic region was a key theater in which nuclear strategy, the concept of mutually assured destruction, was developed and refined. Sounds like a perfect subject for the Wilson Center to take up in our study of America's role in the world today and for the years ahead. I'm honored to welcome our distinguished speakers who represent senior leadership in both the Navy and the Coast Guard, as well as foremost experts on Russian strategy and Russian policy. Across two panels, we'll explore the challenges posed by Russia in the High North, the strategic interests at stake, and how the U.S. and its allies can develop and implement a strategy of maritime deterrence. We're delighted to co-host this event with the Center for Maritime Strategy, which is leading the national discussion of maritime power and international security. I'd like to welcome Admiral Jamie Fogo, Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy. The Admiral's long and distinguished naval service was capped by his command of U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa, and commander of the Allied Joint Forces Command, Naples. He's also served as commander of the U.S. Sixth Fleet. Throughout his distinguished career, Admiral Fogo has championed the U.S. Navy as an extended arm of diplomacy, and I can think of no better person to help us understand the complex challenges of naval deterrence in the High North, and to partner with the Wilson Center and our Polar Institute on today's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Fogo. Jamie, to the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many friendly faces here in the audience, physically with us at the Wilson Center today, and also 1,000 people registered online. That is absolutely extraordinary, and we probably set a record, so thank you for taking time to be with us. On behalf of my team, who's with me here today from the Center of Maritime Strategy, thank you for joining us for this afternoon roundtable panel discussion on crafting and sailing the strategy during the Deterring Russia at Sea in the High North Symposium, put together by Wilson and co-hosted by us. A special thanks to Dr. Rebecca Pincus and Mr. Jack Durkee and Ambassador Green for their part in organizing this event, and to the Wilson Center for its global work. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you today. So we're going to wrestle with a couple of burning questions, and I don't know that we're going to come up with the definitive answers, but first off, what does maritime deterrence look like in the high north? And what is the right balance to deter Russia without escalating a conflict in the high north? We've already got enough problems in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and the Black Sea. Why is the Arctic so important? And I think our speakers are going to treat this both strategically and economically here today. And what lessons learned can we have applied from recent Navy exercises with allies and partners? And we have British Admiral Anthony Remington here today to treat some of those allied contributions. These questions and how the United States and its allies characterize, prioritize, and implement naval strategy in the high north are actually of the utmost importance in the midst of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Why? Well, if we have to deter in the Arctic, how are we going to task organize to do that? And what lessons learned are we going to take away from the Ukraine conflict? Now, before we move into the first panel, and I'll be moderating the second panel, my colleague, Commander Rachel Gosnell, who's working on her PhD at the University of Maryland, has got the first panel. I want to tell you a little bit about my Arctic bona fides. First of all, I've been north of the Arctic Circle, 66 North, many times. I've surfaced in submarines at the North Pole, and I have great respect for the challenges of naval operations in the Arctic environment. Now, in your brochure, for those of you that are here, I'm not sure you can see it online, but I'll describe it for you. There's a picture of a U.S. Navy submarine called USS Sea Devil, surfaced at the North Pole in 1985, in the middle of the Cold War, the third battle of the Atlantic. That was my war as a lieutenant, and that's me in the picture, and I think it's probably circled in red, where I'm standing with the wardroom of USS Sea Devil as we punched through some pretty hard and thick ice with our fairwater planes in the ice pick position that's vertical, just like a can opener, and we popped up. And we conducted ice operations there for a day. It was kind of a magical environment. And while we were there at the North Pole and we came up in areas that are known as polynyas, we saw lots of Arctic wildlife, including polar bears, and one that tried to grab our scope. But we went down quickly enough to avoid that, because I think she would have done significant damage. In Arctic foxes, and then, of course, in the water, the whales and the bearded seals, which scream loudly 24/7, so you hardly get any sleep while you're up there. And the Russians were there in force. That was the Cold War. Now, the second picture, which is a hiatus of 16 years later, is the submarine USS Oklahoma City. That was the submarine I commanded, and sadly, just a couple of months ago, I decommissioned out of Puget Sound Naval Shipyard after about 34 years of service. It's a Los Angeles-class fast attack, a lot bigger than that first submarine, Sea Devil. Now, we did not have a hardened sail on the Oklahoma City, so we were not qualified to go punch through pack ice. We were up in the pack ice zone, and we operated in the pack ice zone, and we actually had an opportunity to come up pretty close to the pole, a couple hundred miles south, in a polynya. Why? Because 16 years after that first venture up there, there was a lot more blue and a lot less white. And that was in 2001. So climate change was real back then. It's real today. The other thing, the Russians were back. We didn't see any peace dividend from the Cold War, and they were operating vociferously up there just like we were protecting their bastions. The final thing that bothered me and my crew a lot is when we went up topside for that picture and looked over the side, there were like 1-gallon plastic milk bottles floating by and some plastic trash bags. I couldn't believe it, but the Gulf Stream will carry things up, and then, nefarious nations that don't care toss things off the fantail of their ships. And hopefully we've gotten better. So I took a couple of lessons learned from that. The Russians are there in perpetuity. We do have a climate change problem. We've got to address it, and we have an environmental problem that we have to address. Before retiring in 2020, and Commander Gosnell was with me in my Commander's Action Group, I commanded Naval Forces Europe, Naval Forces Africa, and Joint Forces Command in Naples, Italy. That was the NATO command for all the southern flank. Best job on the planet. And I had the honor of working with allies and partners across Europe. One of the most comprehensive joint exercises that we did was Exercise Trident Juncture in October and November of 2018. 30 nations, including Finland and Sweden, who are NATO aspirants, 50,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, 10,000 tractor rolling vehicles, tanks, and transports, 265 aircraft, and 70 ships, many of them capital ships, Harry S. Truman Strike Group, Iwo Jima Expeditionary Strike Group, 8,500 Americans, 18,000 Americans, and 8,500 of them were U.S. Marines that were operating in, around, and in the air over Norway in a real, no-kidding live fire exercise to deter an enemy invasion, the Russians, from the north. It was an Article 5 operation extraordinaire. When I went to announce this exercise at NATO headquarters in Brussels, a lot of reporters came up to me and said, "Are you crazy? You're going to do this in October and November? That's the coldest, worst, nastiest months in the North Atlantic and in Norway. It's going to be snowing, cold, freezing." I said, "Yeah, you got to train like you fight." And that's why we did it. And we learned a lot of things. Before we move on to the first panel, let me just say that the High North has remained peaceful since Vladimir Putin's savage invasion of Ukraine just 1 year ago. But Russia may still attempt to offset losses in that disastrous Ukraine war with gains on other fronts. So we have to remain vigilant. There's a lot of hardware and software out there that the Russians are producing that is of concern. First and foremost, the Northern Fleet remains intact. The Black Sea Fleet has taken some hits, lost their flagship and a few other ships because the Ukrainians have been very, very crafty in the use of anti-access area denial. But the Northern Fleet is still intact, and they're producing submarines at a very quick rate, and they're high-quality submarines, like the Yasin class. The second of that class, first was Severod Vince. The second submarine is out. They're trying to achieve parity with the USS Virginia class or the British Astute class. And I'm here to tell you, they ain't there yet, but the margins are razor thin. So we have got to continue putting resources in the undersea domain to keep that competitive advantage. And they have a new submarine called Belgorod. This one's interesting. It's strange. It has two primary missions. One, Putin leaked one of the missions, the strike mission himself. When he dropped a piece of paper on a table, a bunch of reporters took pictures of the Poseidon nuclear-tipped torpedo, dual-capable weapon with a nuclear propulsion plant. This thing is 65 feet long. Can you imagine a torpedo that big? Ours are about half that size, the Mark 48s. It's intended to traverse the Atlantic at high speed and go where? Chez nous, right here in America. It's a threat to us. The other mission on that submarine is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance with a deep-diving nuclear-powered mini-sub. And folks, that puts our undersea critical infrastructure at risk. 95% of our market information and our classified information passes by these cables all over the world, and in particular across the Atlantic. And we could be vulnerable, notwithstanding what happened to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So we've got to protect that undersea critical infrastructure. A lot of folks here today from the Naval War College, the fount of knowledge and maritime strategy from Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's the guy that coined the term sea lines of communications. We've got to protect them with our Navy. But he never imagined before he died that the most important sea line of communications in the 21st century was on the bottom of the ocean with these undersea cables. So we must remain vigilant. Russia has expanded and modernized 12 of its Arctic bases, built 3 new ones. And so I think the Arctic could become the next Aberdeen proving ground for weapon systems, not just from the Russians, hypersonics, also from the Chinese. And so the timing of this conference couldn't come at a better time. Thank you, Dr. Pincus, for doing this, and I look forward to the first and second panel.
Thank you, Admiral Fogo. Terrific framing remarks to kick us off today. I'd now like to welcome Rachel Gosnell to the stage to moderate our first panel and welcome the first panel to join us as well. Rachel is director of the European Security Seminar North at the George C. Marshall Center, and a Russia expert, along with our tremendous panel. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Becca, for that kind introduction. And I first want to thank Admiral Fogo for your terrific remarks opening things up. I think you've really highlighted the challenge that lies before us. And I want to thank both the Wilson Center and the Center for Maritime Strategy for taking such a strong leadership role in addressing some of these issues and giving us the opportunity to discuss some very pressing challenges that we will continue to face into the future with Russia in the Arctic. And so I'm joined today by an incredibly distinguished panel. We're hoping to explore some of the challenges posed by Russia in the high north and the strategic interests involved both on the Russian side as well as for allies and partners. So I won't give the full biographies of all of our panelists here. They're in the program or online. If you would like to read them, they're an incredibly distinguished group, but we'd be here all day if we went through all of their accomplishments. So I'll go ahead and just give a brief introduction, and then we'll move into the remarks for the panelists and then into the discussion period. So first, we will have Dr. Michael Peterson, who's coming down from the Naval War College. He's the director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute. After that, we'll have Mr. Matthew Beleg, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center, among other things. And then we'll have Captain Egil Vastrand, who is the Naval and Assistant Defense Attaché at the Royal Norwegian Embassy here in Washington, D.C. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Chris Kofran, who is coming over from the National Security Council, where he is the director for Russia. And with that, no further ado, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. First of all, thank you all for coming. I'm really and truly flattered to be here on a panel with some people who I've known going back a few years now. To be here with friends and Captain Vastrand, it's good to be with you, and hopefully we can continue this new friendship that we've struck up. I am happy to say as well that I am really pleased that management of our Russia policy is in Chris Kofran's really extremely capable hands, and it's really an honor to be sitting on a panel with you as well. So my remarks, let me give you the standard disclaimer first. I'm not speaking for the U.S. Navy. I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the Defense Department or anybody else, just for me. I'd like to start very quickly with some basic thoughts about just deterrence in general, and then move sort of to a more sort of focused discussion about Russia. I think the most important decisive factor in deterrence, the entering variable, if you will, in deterrence is the motivation of the adversary. If we survey deterrence literature going back years, what we see is that if the adversary is strongly motivated, or the potential adversary is strongly motivated to achieve certain ends, then it's very difficult to deter. If that adversary is sort of weakly motivated, or only sort of not as strongly motivated as it could be, then it becomes more easy to deter the adversary. But the more motivated the potential adversary is, the more difficult it is to actually deter. And potential aggressors' motivations are complex, and they typically respond to a number of variables in a number of different ways. So it's really difficult to say one way or another, this will deter Russia, this won't deter Russia. It really does depend on a mixture of factors in time and place. So I think it's important to start from that position. There are a number of things that we can do as a NATO alliance, as the United States, as individual nations, as bilateral relationships that can be helpful. But the entering and most important factor in deterrence is the motivation of the potential aggressor. And I think it's worth keeping in mind as we sort of begin sorting through deterrence solutions here and in the future. So, what are Russia's motivations in the Arctic, and how intensely motivated are they to defend those interests? Well, in addition to Russians viewing the Arctic as their economic linchpin, they also view it as the sort of backbone of their military effort, particularly obviously in the Arctic region, but also into Western Europe as well. We in the West like to call that the northern flank. It's not how the Russians think, as Matthew has aptly pointed out many times. But the Russians are also quite motivated to defend those areas. We've seen in their maritime doctrine, in their contingency planning, and even in their domestic lawmaking, that this is a crucial region that they will aggressively defend. So again, thinking through these issues very, very carefully is really quite important. How does this relate to transatlantic defense concerns? Well, Admiral Fogo pointed out a number of new capabilities that the Russians are developing, and these are critical capabilities from the Russian warfighting perspective. And when you marry those capabilities up with a doctrine that emphasizes maintaining escalation dominance by carrying out fixed strikes against critically important targets, against critical infrastructure targets, then you begin to see why that becomes a sort of critical piece of transatlantic security. We have learned in Ukraine that the Russians are pretty capable at striking fixed infrastructure and are willing to conduct a campaign of cost infliction based on their ability to strike fixed infrastructure targets. So they can credibly hold targets on both sides of the Atlantic at risk, although their ability to do so over time is a bit more limited here in the United States. I can talk a little bit about how the war in Russia has affected, or the war in Ukraine has affected those issues related to the Arctic. That may be best reserved for the question and answer session. But I will say that it is the shortages that we are seeing in Ukraine are also shortages that I think we will see in other critical areas. Like SIGINT and imagery intelligence and in ISR and C2 capabilities. We're seeing a lot of shortages now develop as a result of the war, especially with regard to precision strike. I see no reason that will drop off in the next 3 to 5 years. But the other capabilities that I just described, I think, will also be in short supply. And those are critical to Russia's ability to monitor the Northern Sea Route and the Arctic zone. In closing, I think I think it's worth remembering that Russia is and has been deterred from aggression in the High North. They are not going to war in the High North. They have no plans to go to war in the High North, but that does not make it any less critical to conduct vigilance activities, as they like to say in NATO, and to be vigilant, as Admiral Fogo has pointed out. If we provide this regime with the proper motivation, then their own internal logic, I'm not saying that it is a logical chain of thought, but their own internal logic, the way that Russia thinks, the logic of preserving their own sovereignty will take over, and they may very well lash out. So striking that balance, I think, is critical. So this is where we are in the High North, and this is where I will end. It's not really about confrontation or cooperation. I think those two ideas are too binary. It's about managing the relationship in a careful way. If we have a neighbor who is intent on smashing our fence and throwing garbage in our yard, or doing whatever, letting their dog run loose in our backyard, then we have got to figure out a way to keep them from doing that while also managing that relationship in a way that is productive for us. What will we tolerate? What will we not tolerate? What is the penalty for transgression? These are things that need to be clearly communicated and constantly over time, not once, but again and again and again and again, in order to make it clear how we will manage this relationship with the Russians without escalating to war. And I do think that most of Russia's activities in the High North will take place below the level of armed conflict, if not all of those activities. So it's crucial to think through these challenges as we're moving forward. I'm happy to talk in the broader discussion about what an actual conflict would look like. It's been an area of research of mine for coming up on 5-6 years now. So if that's something that's of interest, we can chat about that. But I think I'll pause there and we can move on.
Excellent. Thanks, and I think we'll continue to see some of these themes repeating themselves, but we look forward to discussing them more in the questions as well. Fantastic. Matthew?
Thanks a lot, Rachel. I actually piggyback on what you just said, Mike, about how important the Arctic is for Russia and what deterrence looks like. The problem with the Arctic is that the Kremlin has been defining itself and self-mythologizing itself as a hyperboreal country, as an Arctic civilization, in the very words of Putin. And all of these accumulate into foreign policy shaping that you can't deter. You cannot deter 30 years of misconceptions in terms of foreign policy, 30 years of self-mythology where NATO is coming out there to get us, NATO's expansion is a threat to national interest, and so on. Which, if you end up, if you spew the same lies for 30 years, you end up believing in them. So there's a bit of truth in there, but there's also a bit of lie in how they've been shaping these things. Enveloped with 20 years of Putinism and enveloped by 10 years of high-power propaganda, of information warfare, information superiority, and social engineering around these things, you end up with the cherry on top that is, in a way, indeterrable. And this is why the Arctic is so important for Russia. And if we sort of grind it down to the reality of it, the threat perception hasn't changed that much since Soviet times, basically. What has changed is the self-realization or the actualization that the Arctic is extremely important to Russian interest after 10 years of being left completely derelict in the 90s, when basically the Kremlin didn't have money to invest in the region, with this sort of self-rediscovery of the importance of the region. A few open doors I'd like to go through is that Russia and the Kremlin don't think the Arctic the way we do. When you think about Arctic, I mean, as a French citizen working in the UK and now in the US, my Arctic vision is a bit weird. But if you sit in the US, then you think about Alaska. If you think about the UK, you think about North Atlantic. If you sit in a Nordic capital, you think about the North, the High North, European High North. The problem is that Russia doesn't see it this way. They see the whole of the Arctic as a long strategic continuum that stretches from the gates of the Kara Sea to the Bering Strait, with North Pole approaches in the middle. So it's pretty vast, it's pretty big, but they have the luxury of time, they have the luxury of space. That is hard to control, of course, that is hard to enforce because of geography, but that they see as a stretch of continuum. So deterrence, in a way, in our own posture lags behind because we generally have a fixed approach to all these stretches of geography. North Pole approaches with continuous US bomber presence, for instance, High North with what NATO can do, and most recently in the context of the expansion of the alliance to Sweden and Finland. And then on the other side of the world with the Bering Sea, with Alaskan approaches and the Canadian Arctic. So a completely different world. So it's not just the High North, it really is about circumpolar activities that Russia understands as such. And whatever we do in all these three segments, they will reproach it and use it against us in any case. Case in point, the validation by the Kremlin that the alliance is expanding, right? With the forthcoming entry of Sweden and Finland into the family of the alliance. It is, in a way, the war in Ukraine has been validating and vindicating the Kremlin's false posture that yes, NATO is expanding, therefore it is an issue of national concern. So this irrational fear of encirclement that is not Arctic specific, there's nothing Arctic specific about it, is also feeding the way Russia is projecting itself and seeing itself in the region. This main threat really is about the fear of encirclement, which is of course completely irrational, but really is the byproduct of tension originating elsewhere than the Arctic. And this is where we also have a problem in terms of escalation and miscalculation, that tension elsewhere could escalate into the Arctic. And this is a point that I've been repeating over and over, that there is a very low likelihood that conflict would erupt in the Arctic proper, but that something somewhere, a flare-up in another theater, would actually erupt and degenerate into the Arctic in terms of horizontal escalation. Not least also because Russia doesn't see the flanks that we have a tendency to at NATO level. It's easy to compartmentalize between flanks, the northern flank, the eastern flank, the southern flank. Russia doesn't see things like this. Once again, they see a strategic continuum and they see horizontal escalation and all these flare-ups happening for a reason. So what may happen in the Baltic Sea will probably and will eventually generate into the Arctic. Escalation in the Black Sea could actually ripple off or rip over or spill over into the Arctic in a way because of said miscalculation, tactical errors. All of this because we cannot trust the Kremlin, we cannot cooperate or communicate, and even if we do, there is absolutely no guarantee that A, the Kremlin will keep its words, and B, they will actually interpret it the way that we want. And that's the problem with deterrence, is that it actually works both ways, right? You have to A, accept the cost that deterrence will have on your own societies and body politic, but also you need to make sure that the signal and the message you send is understood in the other way. It's called basic communication strategies. I'm not talking about Stratcom and all these fancy, these fancy things. I'm just talking about the recipient end, making sure that the message we send will not be distorted and understood as validation that we're out there to get them, which makes deterrence even more complicated. And this is exactly what is Arctic specific about it. And the equation is extremely simple from the Kremlin's point of view. The impact of climate change, because yes, they recognize they have a problem with climate change, is naturally increasing human presence, civilian and military in the region. Increased human presence means that there is a new border, right? The ice is melting. They can no longer rely on their ice coverage. There is a new border. And Russia will do what they do best when the new border arises. They securitize and militarize the hell out of it, because that's what they do. Which means that you have this sort of rejoinder between civilian and military interests. And I'll finish up on this, and this is something very Russian and very complicated in terms of deterring the Russian interest in the Arctic. I call that the double dual approach, the way Russia is understanding the Arctic, in terms of their capabilities and in terms of their infrastructure, but also in terms of their intentions. Forget about defensive capabilities and offensive intent, right? Everything is offensive and defensive at the same time. I think the Kremlin has showed that what they call defensive capabilities to actually offset some of their weaknesses or offset their understanding of the world actually has a very offensive overtone. Ukraine is paying currently the cost of it. Double dual, because Russian infrastructure and Russian capabilities are equally used for civil and military purposes. A lot of Russian military infrastructure and civilian infrastructure are intertwined for life at sea operations, for instance. Radar installations that are used equally for search and rescue operations along the Northern Sea route, but also for military intelligence to monitor, for instance, American presence over the North Pole. So that's, in a way, the sort of dual use intent. And then dual purpose, because what is offensive and defensive no longer matters, right? We can justify the way we want the fact that Russia has defensive intentions. I was the first one to actually write that a few years ago, that Russia had defensive posture in the Arctic. All of this needs to be completely deleted and rewritten to understand the nature of the threat we're facing. And this is where we also have this risk of horizontal escalation once again. And this is deeply Arctic specific. And this is also where we are sort of lagging behind in our understanding of the nature of the environment, not least because it is constantly changing, not just the threat. Russia today, China probably tomorrow in terms of access and presence, but also because of the impact of climate change and what it will have in terms of how we operate and how we sustain a presence there and achieve a credible deterrent, but to be discussed, I guess. Thank you.
Excellent. No, that's terrific, and thank you for those remarks. Captain?
Thank you, Rachel. I will try to contribute to this discussion from a Norwegian perspective. We have all during the last year learned that it is not easy to read Russia. However, from a general perspective, I think we have got a deeper understanding of how far Russia is willing to go by using military force to reach its political objectives. As a result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, our Nordic neighbors Finland and Sweden are now also on the path of becoming NATO members. In the light of these big changes in our security environment, it will be a natural step to take a closer look at existing security policies. Russia is a neighboring country that Norway always will have to relate to when it comes to security. The Norwegian security policy has consisted of a combination of deterrence through the NATO membership and reassurance through dialogue and self-imposed restrictions. Stability and predictability in the region have been of great importance to Norway. Norway has still a dialogue with Russia in areas that are important for safety and predictability in the region, such as fishery management, search and rescue, and the Incidents at Sea Agreement. There is also a hotline between the Norwegian Joint Operational Headquarters and the Northern Fleet to avoid unnecessary escalations and misunderstandings. However, Norway depends in a certain situation on Allied reinforcements if needed, and the establishment of a Joint Force Command Norfolk is assessed to be a vital component to be able to secure the transatlantic connection. The High North is the #1 policy priority for Norway. The region has strategic importance for Norway based on two main factors: the economic potential and the geopolitical location next to Russia. The region has been an area of low tension after the Cold War ended, but this has an obvious potential to change to higher tension in the future based on strategic interest and future competition in the High North. The Russian posture has also become more offensive. We have in recent years experienced examples of aggressive Russian behavior through simulated attacks, aggressive operations during the NATO exercise, which Admiral Foggo mentioned, exercise Trident Juncture, and GPS jamming that has affected the civilian air traffic in the northern part of Norway. The region has also emerged as an increasingly important resource base for supporting the Russian economy. And together with a huge modernization and build-up of new infrastructure and advanced military capabilities in the region, the High North is not going to be of less importance for the Russians in the future. It is likely that Russia is willing to use military force if they assess their strategic interests being threatened. Norway has emphasized the importance of military presence in the High North. The number of Norwegian high-end capabilities available for credible deterrence is limited compared to Russia's military capability. And the political authorities in Norway are positive to an increased allied activity on Norwegian territory and in the maritime areas in the High North. The question is how we as allies can conduct sufficient deterrence in an efficient way without initiating any serious escalations of the situation in the area. To be able to do so, we need to understand the region and the Russian objectives, and that is not always easy.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And now, Mr. Coffin.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate Mike's introductory comments, but I can't take all the credit. We have a team of people managing Russia policy, and my boss, Eric Green, I think deserves most of the credit, but I do appreciate the shout out there. The challenge of a scene setter is that the scene has been set very well already, and our high-level remarks may rhyme a little bit. But first, I'd like to outline a little bit of the high-level challenges as we see them from the White House. Most of my comments would focus on that security aspect of the problem. We have a director for Arctic at the NSC who's far more versed in the kind of totality of the policy issues than I am in particular. But since the last national strategy for the Arctic region was published in 2013, we've seen increasing competition in the Arctic, which was a major impetus for the administration to release an updated strategy in 2022. However, its intended release date, which preceded the invasion of Ukraine, was complicated by the invasion, and as a result, it called into question many of the strategy's end states and got pushed to later in the year. So while the invasion has proved to be an impediment to cooperation with the Russians in the High North, the administration still considers that a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Arctic is an achievable end state, and is working to sustain the institutions meant to further those goals. But because of Russia's bellicosity, perhaps it risks becoming a more securitized challenge than it ought to be or otherwise would be, as sort of Matthew outlined very well. Before the invasion, most of us thought that the Arctic was one region where we could find real common cause with the Russians. And ultimately, we still believe that to be the case, but Russia seems to have linked cooperation in almost all spheres to our support for Ukraine, and that extends even to the New START treaty. But I like and second Mike's ideas on the idea of management. It's not a binary cooperation or conflict idea. It is one more of management and a case-by-case mutual benefit sort of idea here. As I mentioned, I can't really opine on our economic or natural resources policy in the Arctic, but I will say that America's perpetual security goals in the region are to deter threats to the United States and our allies, enhance the capabilities required to defend our interests, and coordinate approaches with our allies and mitigate the risks of unintended escalation. And the traditional leaders in this realm, obviously, are the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, and all of our allied militaries, and the U.S. State Department also helps to implement our goals in this region. And next, I'll briefly go over how we see the Russians the Russian challenge in this region. Obviously, it's been mentioned, they view the region through the lens of economic development. It's a proverbial goose that laid the golden egg, or at least it thinks it'll become that. And it's correct to say that maybe Russia is encroaching into the global commons in this area and needs the muscle to support those ambitions. But also, Russia is building up the military in this region, and Matthew really outlined this well, to posture itself to monitor and control it. And as the Arctic becomes more open to transit, development, and other international activities, it really is a dual-use dilemma, as Matthew outlined very well. So yes, we don't. The military buildup is concerning, and we don't want to downplay it, but we tend to see this as a restitution of Soviet-era capabilities more than a true buildup. Because Russia's presence and infrastructure had atrophied so seriously after the collapse of the Soviet Union that they really needed to build up in this area or restore what they used to have. It also remains to be seen how much Russia can prioritize the Arctic, because since February of last year, the Russians have lost a tremendous amount of military capacity in Ukraine that it will need to restore, which could take decades, and the war is not over yet. And Russia does tend to prioritize strategic and nuclear capabilities at the expense of others. So I think at least in the nuclear realm, we'll see continued investment in the strategic submarines and those sorts of things and strategic infrastructure. But we also need to consider that for the United States, much of our Arctic focus is one state, Alaska and the surrounding waterways. But for the Russians, as of course has been outlined already, it encompasses something like 53% of the Arctic Ocean area. And its largest naval bases and the largest proportion of its SSBN fleet are behind the Arctic Circle. And that means so Russia has a bastion defense mindset for parts of the Arctic because they deploy their Northern Fleet SSBNs up there. So naturally, while Russia has clear strategic interests in this region, the issue is that we don't think Russia will cooperate in good faith with other Arctic nations, at least not yet. There's also the problem that Russia thinks it owns the Arctic, or at least has primacy over it. One can't forget the flag planting stunt on the seabed from a few years ago. And after all, at minimum, it wants to control the Northern Sea route. Also recall that Russia passed a law in November of last year that required Russian approval for foreign warships to go through the Northern Sea route, some of which it considers its internal waters. This complicates an already difficult operational environment up in the Arctic. So I concur with everyone's comments on escalation and won't repeat them, but lastly, a few words on deterrence and potential constructive ways ahead with Russia in this area. First, with any question of deterrence, one has to ask, deter them from what? And if we go back to our first principles and our strategic goals to defend the homeland, defend our allies, deter attack against the homeland, we think we're appropriately postured. Some of us also don't think deterrence is necessarily the right word. We could ask me offline about that, but I like Mike's comment again on the binary, getting rid of the binary. It's not cooperation, it's not conflict. Well, I think it's also this way about deterrence. It's not necessarily management, it's restraint. It's something more active. Deterrence is a state of mind, it's not an activity. So we could talk more about that. And lastly, I'll pose this thought to the collective for your consideration, that in outer space, we've carved out life and death exceptions to policy for cooperating with the Russians. And maybe this is a useful model for moving forward in the Arctic with the Russians, is basing sort of how we've taken the International Space Stations or space cooperation with NASA and Roscosmos. These could be models going forward, but I'll pose that to the people in the group far smarter than me on all of those issues, and I'll turn it back to the chair. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And we'll go ahead and we'll take some questions from the audience, and I believe the microphones will be coming around. While we do that, I'll take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question. I think we've had a tremendous discussion here of deterrence. We've looked at some of the economic, the security interests of Russia, what's driving their behavior, particularly those deep-seated insecurities of encirclement. And I'd like to bring it back to the maritime domain, since we're focusing today on deterring Russia at sea in the high north. And I'd like to ask what deterrence, if that's even the right word, in the maritime domain looks like. As we all know, the Russian Northern Fleet holds a premier place in their military. It's the only fleet with the status of a military district. And as we heard from Admiral Fogo, they've got a lot of phenomenal technologies that are coming online. They're really placing a preeminent position on the Arctic and on the North Atlantic, the high north. So what should we be looking at for Russian behavior in the high north, and how do we think about this both in a more broad deterrence, but also more narrowly as we're looking at the maritime domain, as we're looking to ensure international norms, customs are adhered to, and potentially, as you mentioned, Chris, what does that look like if there's some element of cooperation there?
Well, that's a good question. Honestly, we have the Arctic Council. That modality is currently, I wouldn't say moribund, but our cooperation there is not what it could be because of the war. Russia has the chair until I think May, and it turns over to Norway, I believe. So maybe we need to look beyond the Arctic Council as a way for managing relations in these areas. I think there's a role for private industry and scientific development up there to kind of communicate the needs and get it out of the realm of governments. That could be a way to reduce the emotional level of the conversation. But as far as behavior, I think cooperating in good faith is really what we would expect out of the Russians in particular. With Finland and Sweden potentially coming into the alliance, the Arctic Council will maybe assume a new character, where Russia will be the only non-NATO member in it. Although objectively, I don't know how much that changes anything. It's not like the Finns and the Swedes were always siding with Russia on everything before that. So yeah, I think that's what I would say. You guys have.
Just a couple of thoughts on that as well. I think that in many cases, it's going back to Chris's point. What are we deterring the Russians from? That's the first, going back to first principles, and the way you outlined it as defending the homeland, defending our allies and partners, I think is a good way to think about that. And deterrence takes many forms. There's a military aspect. There's another sort of broader economic, political, and diplomatic aspect to it as well. So it's kind of a whole of government kind of solution. But when we think about just military deterrence at first, I'm kind of the opinion that the way you keep a potential aggressor from becoming aggressive with you is that you are bigger and stronger than they are. And so one of the things that I think is important to consider is what areas of call it Russian warfighting strategy will they rely on? Well, we know based on what they say publicly and what they've done in Ukraine that they will do things like rely on, as I mentioned before, conventional strikes against strategically important targets. So one way to deter them from thinking that that's going to be a good way to go is to harden targets. Develop integrated air and missile defense in places like the UK. Put integrated air and missile defense in places like the United Kingdom. It's integrated air and missile defense. It's not bombers. So that is a sort of different posture that Russia can assess on their own. At the same time, I think undersea warfare capabilities are also going to be very, very important. We know, based on what our friends in U.S. Fleet Forces and Second Fleet have said in previous years, that Russian submarines have arrived off the east coast of the United States. Well, that means that we need the ability to keep those submarines from operating there. So that's those are the kinds of military technologies I'm thinking about. But there are also, I think, a number of important sort of broader whole of government tools to consider. We are thinking a lot about this problem of Russia either operating at below the level of armed conflict, or in some cases we're worried now about Russia escalating to a nuclear level. I think those concerns might be a little inflated, but as the Russian conventional military sort of weakens, they may rely on nuclear weapons a little bit more. But the critical piece here, I think, is understanding what those other legal solutions might be. I'm not an expert on that, but understanding the sort of broader options from a legal perspective, from a lawfare perspective. I know we in the United States don't don't believe that we use lawfare. That's for other people to do, and we're just going to behave according to the law. I think that these are important questions that for us to think about as we go forward and sort of determine what those individual pieces might be.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the deterrence part here. I think it's important to understand Russian behavior, and to be able to do that, you have to keep a close eye on them. Norway has done that for is doing that every day. We have assets in the high north every day, keeping an eye on what they are doing in the maritime domain and other domains. And we have a good track of a good understanding of what is going on. I also think it's important then, when you understand their behavior, that you have a good balance with what kind of assets you use. I think the presence, good allied presence in the area is very important. Russians, they need to see that we are able to operate in that environment, and also that we are able to operate together as allies. And to do that, I think it's important that we, when it comes to activity in that area, it's important that the activity is well coordinated, that it is efficient. And then I think we need to have a good communication between those allies that operates in the area. I don't say we don't have it, but we have to keep a focus on that especially. So just a small comment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Matthew?
And to try to have my take on the what are we deterring them from. So it's, deterrence needs to be tailored to what we're facing. What we're facing is how Russia interprets and projects itself in the Arctic. If you look at, they want to protect the Northern Sea route, make it more Russian than Russian already and turn it into internal waters. This is basic lawfare, right? This is the Russia's interpretation of UNCLOS, of the ICE clause, specifically of Article 234. Very technical, but still, we need to deter them here, show them in terms of access, in terms of our own understanding of the law, the basic law at sea, that we stand for what's right. And then we adopt the message. Russia fundamentally believes, the Kremlin at least, they're obsessed with the fact that the US will conduct soon a freedom of navigation operation against the Northern Sea route to try to challenge Russia's perception that it is a Russian body of water. So the question you ask me is, yes, but you need a body of law that tells you what the body of body of water is. So that body of law was actually enacted in this November, December 2022 law that one of my colleagues mentioned, that actually forbids the presence of foreign flags into the Northern Sea route. There you go. You have your element of legal warfare that tells you this is the, if the United States is to conduct a FONOP, a freedom of navigation operation, there we go. We have the body of legal document that tells you this is what the FONOP is going to be about, right? And telling you exactly what the straits they're supposed to be closed. So they are slowly getting into that logic, that we are out there to challenge them. And therefore, we need a counter-argument in terms of deterrence to show them that no, we are actually, yes, maybe we are preparing for forms of FONOP to show that there is still freedom of navigation, innocent passage, but that this is not challenging Russia's presence in legally and internationally recognized bodies of water. Same, in a way for, and I'll stop there because there's plenty of things to go through in terms of what Russian priorities are, but they believe that they can, close off access to the GI-UK gap or the GIN gap, for instance. So when you look at all these maps, made from Russian experts, even Western experts, sort of falling into these pitfalls, thinking, oh yeah, they are going to create, the proverbial angry red circle, as some of my colleagues would say, or the angry bubbles spreading through the North Atlantic. Well, yes and no. It's a bit more complicated than it seems, right? It's not a two-dimensional problem to a four-dimensional issue. Plus, Ukraine has also taught us that there's a lot of limitations to these things. But where is our narrative, right? Where is our basic communication that says, well, it's not because we have a form of Iron Dome falling upon us because Russia wants to, that our planes will fall out of the sky, or that submarines will actually run out of diesel the moment they reach this Iron Dome. All of this needs to be, sort of retro-engineered in terms of the psychological deterrence in a way to show that we own a form of message. This is beyond just deterring the activity, we need to deter the message as well, which we are not doing efficiently enough, and that we should be spending more time on. So once again, not StratCom, not all these fancy things, just communication.
Excellent. Thank you all. Do we have any questions in the audience now? Great.
Good afternoon. Carl Gillis, the Belgian Defense Attaché. First of all, I would like to thank the panel for the clear and concise manner in which they set the scene. Given the fact that the Arctic is still a very harsh and also very complex environment to operate in currently and probably for the next few years, on the other hand, military capabilities capable of operating in such an environment are scarce or certainly not abundantly available. So, and you suggested, Dr. Peterson, the question: what would a conflict actually look like in the Arctic in the near and the midterm future? Thank you.
So I'm happy to discuss the last part of that question. Thank you for asking. The issue with the Arctic is not, as Matthew pointed out, it's not that a conflict may begin in the Arctic and remain isolated in the Arctic, or that a conflict may begin, say, in the Black Sea or the Baltic and stay there. The way Russian strategists think about this is sort of theater-wide and across multiple theaters of military operation. So a conflict in the Arctic is a possibility, but it's more about fighting from within the Arctic outside of it. I think that the Russians will look to establish, as we know, a sort of bastion defense, first of all. And when we say defense, what we really mean is cost imposition. I have colleagues who have worked on this in the past, and what they really mean is imposing cost to enemy access. So that's a start. But we also know from Russian warfighting strategy that they have these capabilities. First of all, they have these capabilities that allow them to conduct both local strikes and theater-wide long-distance precision strikes based in the Arctic, particularly on the Kola Peninsula. I think what we would see in the initial period of war, if there's a conflict between the United States and NATO, or the United States and Russia, NATO and Russia. In the unlikely event that happens, I think if based on Russian military strategy, what we would see is an effort early on in the initial period of war, this very intense period of war at the beginning of a conflict, to create space in Russia's Arctic zone. That is, create this operational maneuver space within which it can then begin to launch theater-level attacks using long-range precision strike munitions against places like important bases in Norway, or farther down the coast in Norway, in Åland, and perhaps as far as Bergen, into the United Kingdom, into Iceland, and then even farther afield. Admiral Foggo has pointed out when he was commander at NAVUR that Russia has precision strike munitions that can reach across Europe from the Kola Peninsula. And I think that's what this effort would be, is an effort to create this zone in which Russia can reach out from the Arctic and attack other areas. So it's not necessarily a conflict itself that takes place itself in the Arctic. So what is the challenge then? The challenge then for NATO is delivering force to that area that defeats that capability. And I don't believe hemming them in is enough, because they have a long enough range precision strike to execute those operations from deep within the Arctic region, in the Barents Sea, off the Kola Peninsula, in the Kola Gulf. Hemming them in there is not enough. Because they can reach out far enough. So then it's a matter of going up there and trying to dig out those capabilities and eliminate those capabilities. That's a tough job because the distances are so severe, even with great allies like the Norwegians in place, and hopefully soon the Swedes and the Finns. Those are long distances to go in difficult conditions, and I think it's going to be very, very difficult to execute that. That's a job. It's where I think navies are important. It's where I think a long distance precision strike with an air force is important. So. That's going to be the contest. Can the NATO and the United States move enough force into those areas in the Arctic where Russia is sourcing these attacks from a naval and air perspective, not a ground perspective, a naval and air perspective, and can Russia impose enough cost to keep the United States and NATO at bay?
Anyone else? No? Okay, excellent. Next question.
Hi, Kim Murphy with Airbus US. What impact do you think the Chinese incursions and rhetoric with respect to the Arctic region are having on the Russian intention or, intent to be aggressive or cooperation going forward?
Should I start?
Yeah, sure.
It's a great question. Thank you. So, once again, not Arctic specific. China-Russia relations are, run both deeper and more superficial than we generally believe. They're Not so, they don't need to be friends to cooperate, and they don't need to sign documents like we do in the West to actually do things behind the scenes and in the shadows. What is Arctic specific about it is that China is, well, first of all, they have a polar approach. Everything is linked between the Arctic and Antarctica, as above, so below. They're one of the few countries who actually have the resource, the presence, and the time to think global and to think polar in both poles. So that's the first thing, which means that what they learn and deploy in Antarctica, for instance, in terms of their presence, their posture, their ambitions, they can replicate in the Arctic, and vice versa. When it comes to Russia-China relations in the Arctic in general, Russia needs China more than the other way around, which is quite interesting. Not least because China can bid for time. If they need to wait for the non-linearity of climate change to allow access to the central Arctic Ocean, they will. They don't need to cross through the Northern Sea route, which they didn't last year, for instance. They don't need to invest too much time and effort in trying to revamp Russia's presence and infrastructure, specifically civilian or energy infrastructure in the region. They can just wait it off. They can test the waters, develop their own capabilities, and bid for time. Just as much as Russia actually needs Chinese subsidies. They need it to export their LNG at low prices, yes, but at least to sell their LNG. They need China to be more present when it comes to managing the impact of climate change by rebuilding infrastructure in the region, for instance, assisting economic development that the Kremlin just cannot afford, specifically in the current context. So a lot of mismatch in the perceptions and in the intentions. And what is really sort of making Moscow's clocks tick is the fact that China's projecting a different form of ambition in the region. It's not military presence, it's not defense of national interest and security. It really is about, a 360 approach to the region. Access for commerce, for shipping, for resources for fish stocks, for instance, and protein stocks in the region, which is impacting Norway a lot, for instance, when I look at the Svalbard fisheries protection zone, for instance. And the getaway to the Arctic for China is Russia. So there is also, Russia needs China, but in a way, China needs Russian access. At this very instant, they need Russia to say yes or no through the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation for access and presence. So a lot of insecurity going on both ways, but mostly on the Russian side. Not least also because China is very active in the rhetoric and how they're projecting their presence. You might remember what they wrote in this white paper a few years ago, that they are a near Arctic state, whatever that means. We're still trying to wrap my head around that. It was a beautiful, beautifully crafted package of soft power intentions, the win-win situation, which is, as we all know, win for Beijing and win for China, not for the recipient countries. But what really got under Moscow's skin, and also in a lot of Arctic capitals, is that, well, you are either Arctic or not, right? So this is also projecting intentions that go beyond what is acceptable as an observer member of the Arctic Council, for instance, or as a respectable partner of Arctic operations. Beijing got a lot of pushback, not officially, but behind the scenes in the diplomatic world, saying, wait a minute, you guys are not going to pull that off. You are not going to project yourself as a new Arctic state because, anybody, Vanuatu, the islands can become a new Arctic state if they want to, which is leading to a discrepancy between access and presence in the Arctic as a circumpolar actor and the rest of the world, basically. So they have toned down that rhetoric, but they probably are still sort of having lofty goals and ambitions in operating in the region, but with time. And time is on their side for that matter. So.
Yeah, if I could just add to that very briefly, the near Arctic issue is very interesting. I think it antagonized the Russians quite a bit, as was mentioned. And the Chinese, interestingly, are keeping their distance militarily. And I think that's intentional, not to antagonize the Russians. The Russians are very suspicious of Chinese intentions. Obviously, they want the resource extraction and the investment and the infrastructure development, but that's about it. So the Russians are being very cautious about managing. The word managing is coming up a lot here today. Managing this relationship with the Chinese, probably at the highest level, at the presidential levels. But we do see a lot of suspicion in Russia. So that's something that they're going to have to deal with going forward.
I can just short comment. I agree with most of what has been said here, but I think the Russians, I don't think they want anyone else, non-Arctic nations up in the Arctic. But when you look at how the environment is developing now with the Russians more and more in the cold, they could be a risk that they feel the pressure to have somebody supporting them to legitimize what their own interests in that region. You have kind of a window here that the Chinese, in a way, can exploit if they want to, in my mind. So that's just a short comment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Terrific perspectives. Do we have any other questions in the back?
Hi, Shannon Jenkins from Coast Guard's Head of Coast Guard's Arctic Policy Office. So we talked a lot, not just today, but in other areas about how conflict in other regions has the potential for spilling over into the Arctic. I submit that it already has. It's not military conflict, but it is a major risk of destabilization of the cooperation and stability that we have in that region. Looking at it from the local to the global level on that. I appreciate the comments about Norway, how you share a border with Russia. So does the U.S. The Coast Guard has been at the forefront for a long time in interacting with our counterparts in the Russian Border Guard on shared interest in IUU fishery, search and rescue, spill response, those types of things. Those communications have been significantly curtailed since Ukraine. And that has limited our U.S. ability to influence and modify Russian behavior through those communications. But looking at more globally, my biggest concern is the destabilization of the Arctic Council. That is the preeminent governance structure for the Arctic. And if we're not communicating with Russia through any mechanisms from local to global, then that opens the door for others to come in and assert influence. China. So right now it seems like deterrence is our only tool. And use the saying, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. One, how effective is deterrence if it's our only tool? But then two, to talk a little bit about what Chris was talking about what are our other mechanisms? How do we move beyond deterrence? And how do we avoid escalating tensions that are going to further destabilize that Arctic region? Thanks.
I could start, I guess. Yeah, thanks for that. Obviously, we think about the Coast Guard a lot because we do share a border with Russia, and people do tend to forget that sometimes. But I think escalation isn't a one-way street. I don't think at the end of the day the Russians want destabilizing behavior or escalation any more than anybody else does. And we sometimes when people talk about war spilling over, conflict arising in the Arctic, that it sounds like a one-way street. And we have channels of communication with Russia that we can get messages to them at high levels. So it's, at least from an administration perspective, the war in Ukraine has put a lot of other things on ice that aren't critical to national security. But obviously the Arctic is extremely important to national security. So where that fits in is a very interesting question. But the idea that that escalation is going to be driven by Russia, we do need to think that that's probably not likely. Because it's not a one-way street.
I guess I would answer that by saying a couple of things. You know, we've been using this idea of managing the relationship for a while, and I think what you're describing is a part of what I would argue is something that needs to happen. It's not binary between cooperation or competition. We have to understand, guided by a set of strategic principles, how we will manage this on a case-by-case basis. The other point I would make here is that I am one of these people who actually thinks that as long as Russia is running the Arctic Council, we shouldn't be using it because there needs to be a cost imposed for this war in Ukraine. The other argument that I might make is that if we should be using it. So I'm of two minds about this, and we should be using it to tell them no to every single initiative that they propose in the Arctic. As a result of the war in Ukraine, we will not be doing this until you withdraw your troops from these contested areas, period. I know that people like to keep the Arctic isolated diplomatically from the rest of the world, but I'm sorry, but that's impossible. It's just not realistic to do. So there are two courses of action that we can take with the Arctic. It can be a matter of managing this on a case-by-case basis, but broadly speaking, I do think that there is a way. I'm not sure that the Arctic Council is the way, at least while Russia is in charge.
If I can add to that, I completely agree. I mean, the mantra of low tension, Arctic exceptionalism, the Gorbachev era of low tension, all of this is great, but A, it's a mantra, B, it's dead. Let's be honest. The Arctic right now is a high octane, loads of burning fire kind of environment. We just need to rejoin in a way. Which means that our framework, our state of mind needs to change on just as much as we were asking the question, what do we deter Russia from? The other question we need and the conversation we need to be having at NATO level, at European level, and everywhere really, which is not Arctic specific, is what do we want from the Kremlin and with the Kremlin moving forward? And if cooperation is not possible, how do we go about our own messaging, right? Because in as much as we cannot tether the Kremlin back into the sort of framework of understanding of law, of the international rules-based order, all of the nice things that we take for granted, but that Russia consistently likes to break, then what is the next step for us, right? So either we accept that logic that all windows are closed, the discussions we were having pre-2022, even pre-COVID on low-level, the Midi-Gerasimov, sort of back channel on low-level, male-male depoliticized contacts to relearn how, that we are all human beings and we have, similar understanding of things. What we can learn from, countries like Norway or Finland in terms of day-to-day management of the border, day-to-day management and deconfliction, and de-escalation of everything. Everything needs to be relearned in a way. So either we accept that the windows of opportunity are closed, at least while the Kremlin leadership is what it is, and this is a post-Putin thing, because the spoiler alert is that it's not because Putin will go away at some point that things will necessarily be better for us. And the second spoiler alert of the day is that maybe we should start thinking about what a more active presence of NATO, for instance, in terms of deterrence would look like. Is it an Arctic 7 discussion without Russia, right? The eighth member of the Arctic. And if so, what does not just an Arctic, but a genuine circumpolar level of cooperation looks like, minus Russia? Because we can't just stop, and I agree with with what Mike said, we need to say no to the Kremlin, but we can't just stop going about non-politicized items on the agenda, like scientific cooperation, for instance. Scientists working on glaciology didn't ask for the war and are actually now suffering from the consequences of that war, even though it's far beyond their day-to-day things. But all of this is instrumentalized, of course, by the Kremlin in terms of, and it's a sort of, other issue in Antarctica, for instance, the way they're using ocean science as a justifier for a lot of their behavior. China's doing the same. But the bottom line is all of these things should continue, but maybe they should continue just in the Arctic 7 by excluding Russia for the time being and accepting the cost that it has. Because once again, deterrence works both ways. We need to accept the cost we impose on them, and we need to accept that it will be costly for us as well. But yeah, it's a multi-generational issue, really. So.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions in the room?
I'm going to exercise director privilege to ask a question of this terrific panel. In the last year, we've seen a spate of attacks on subsurface critical infrastructure, whether that's a fiber cable to Svalbard or the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. These have not been directly attributed to Russia, of course. Unknown human actors are at fault. But how do we deter Russia from attacking critical infrastructure using their advanced spate of subsurface technologies that Admiral Fogo mentioned, thinking about hybrid or critical infrastructure attacks which fall below the threshold of conflict? We've mostly been talking about deterrence at the higher end. How do we deter at the lower end? Thanks.
Well, I think that's a best question answered by someone from Norway.
Yeah, I can try to answer some of it, at least. I can say that there has now been mapped 9,000 kilometers of pipeline in that area now after the Nord Stream incident. And that has mostly been done by the offshore companies themselves and in cooperation with the navies. And I think in the future, I think it's important that still it's the offshore companies that they have the equipment, the capabilities to monitor their own pipelines. So it's important to have a good communication between the commercial industry, like those companies, and the military side. So we are vigilant, and we can keep track on the status of that huge network. So it's difficult to kind of guard those things. 9,000 kilometers, that's a kind of a lot of pipeline. So we need to do something smart here, and I think a cooperation like we have started now, I think that's the way to go.
Briefly. So the question is how to stop it, and that's really hard, because I don't know if we'll necessarily be able to stop it. But what we could possibly do is impose a reputational cost that could cause them to change the modality of operations, change a location, change a delay when they do it, decide not to at a different point, and through that reputational damage can come about through exposure. So I think exposure is very important. The administration has been on the forefront of downgrading information and sharing it globally and publicly to show Russian actions in the bad light that they are. And I think that might be one way potentially to go forward here. The other one is presence. So the combination of those things, the presence to physically keep them at bay, and the exposure to create that global reputational cost, because it's a global commons, right? You have lots of economic data and internet information, and banking and intelligence and communications, and everything goes across those cables, not just for us, but for everybody else. So that's something to think about.
Mike, do you have anything to add?
I think that Chris raises a really interesting point about presence. It's really expensive. It's really hard. This is I think a problem. I think that our friends in the Navy can best describe for us, but that's a real challenge. But I agree that it's got to be done, and it's the sort of thing. There are sort of tactical solutions to this problem in the short term. Perhaps there might be an operational solution, but I really do think that to get at this, we need to get at it left of bang, as they say, prior to the actual physical capability gets out there to that cable. There has to be a way to monitor this and to clearly communicate to Moscow that this type of behavior will not be tolerated. And that there will be costs when that type of behavior is exposed. Now, what those costs are is a matter of policy that I'm not in a position to describe. But at the same time, there is that presence issue that we need to sort of solve. I don't know that there are good answers to that yet, but I do think it's a really critical issue for navies plural, not just the Norwegians, but navies in the region to resolve.
And I think you have two levels of question. You have the wartime destruction, let's say, of undersea cables, and the not wartime, right? The under the level of military conflict, and those presence and exposure operations would be completely different in those cases. And you could be inventive on presence. You could do things remotely now. We have uncrewed vehicles. You have subsurface acoustics. You have all sorts of things. You can federate a monitoring network. So there's a lot of, it's not necessarily a destroyer out there patrolling thousands and thousands of miles of cable, but there is innovative networked ways to have this presence, and through that presence then expose. Wartime is different, and that's kind of a left of bang problem that we always deal with. Obviously, that's about all I can say. Yeah.
Do you have anything else, Matthew?
No, not much. I completely agree. And, reputation, presence, capabilities, you alluded to it. There's a bunch of things we can do in terms of revamping the network of sensors that we have for early warning, or more maritime domain awareness for peacetime and wartime, and at wartime that would transcribe into better anti-submarine warfare capabilities as well. And civil and military cooperation, you alluded to it. As well, on the fact that it also needs to be a question of the industry and the policy world mixing to make sure the systems are resilient. There is a form of redundancy, multi-layered redundancy, to make sure that these critical national infrastructure are survivable, and even if there's an impact, we can recover quickly. In as much as we can't deter these activities, because they will come, we need to make them survivable, the infrastructure themselves, and because we can't build them anti-fragile. Stuff will happen, but we can at least make them resilient by default.
So just a follow-up to that. Then we've seen that there's a lot of interest, obviously, in the Arctic. I think you have over 1,000 people dialing in today. It shows that there's a tremendous amount of interest. But is the Arctic getting the resources, the resourcing, the prioritization that it needs to sort of confront this problem set? Both at the NATO level, you're going to bring in 2 more Arctic nations into the alliance. National policy, we saw that the U.S. just released the national strategy for the Arctic region this past October. Defense policy, looking at presence. What does that mean? And then industry, is the defense industry, are we focused enough on the problem set up there to be able to be successful?
That's a huge question. Thanks. I'll be as quick as I can here. One, I think there is an important acknowledgement both in the entire transatlantic community of the criticality of the Arctic and the growing criticality of the Arctic. It's not going to decline. That I think there's a general consensus that that's true. I think the challenge for the United States, and we have a very hard time doing this, is determining priorities. Yes, the Arctic is a critically important region, but guess what? So is the Indo-Pacific. Are we going to take resources from the Indo-Pacific region and put them in the Arctic? I have a hard time understanding that, to be perfectly honest with you. We have to acknowledge the trade-offs that are in place, and I think that the sort of political and diplomatic mechanisms are in place. I think from a policy perspective, I think we understand that. But from a sort of from the perspective of military resources, it's very difficult to sort of to see a solution through there. Last thing on the point is that I think it would be very interesting to hear from the Norwegians about this, but in the conversations that I've had with people in European navies, I think that they take this extremely seriously, and that's to their great credit. The war in Ukraine has crystallized thinking in ways that I've not seen in my career. And I'm enormously encouraged by how seriously European, both military personnel and political personnel, are taking the Russian challenge, not just to the east, but also to the north.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you have to take a very careful consideration just of the risk, the scale of the risk, the scale of the problem, because like Mike said, everything is important. Right, and everything up in there is important. So we've got to really prioritize what it is that we want to devote the resources to. So what is it that we need? Is it icebreakers? Do we have enough icebreakers? Probably not, right? You hear this all the time. We don't have enough icebreakers, but Russia has 1,000 and they're all nuclear powered, right? So do we need more destroyers? Do we need more military presence? Do we need more subsidies for scientific research? Like exactly what it is, because it's a huge problem. It's a huge area with lots of intersecting policy problems and dilemmas. So I'm thankfully not the Arctic director at the NSC, so that's not my job. But I think a very cogent and focused prioritization of what it is exactly, and also our alliance is a asymmetric strength there, because we have a lot of very capable friends in this region that can help us help them and vice versa.
Yeah, just very quickly, I completely agree. What we need is a gap analysis, right? Because we already have a lot of resources, we have a lot of capabilities, but we really haven't asked that question in common. And what is it that we need to make sure that we are present, we're strong and resilient in the region? So I think it's taking stock of existing endeavors, taking stock of capabilities, and looking where the gaps are and fill them up with maybe it's icebreakers, maybe it's better governance, maybe it's more eyes in the skies or at sea, and then we'll know. But we haven't done that gap analysis, not least because it's a very touchy issue. Because should it be at NATO individual level, should be at individual Arctic nation level. Obviously cannot be done with Russia. So it's a question that needs to be asked as well, right? The role and place of NATO in this ecosystem, and I think we're now alluding to it with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, but then it needs to be on paper, right? It needs to be turned into a good policy and good governance around that. So a lot of questions before, spending a lot of, the bang for the buck on this. We need to take stock of what's existing and do a gap analysis, I think.
Excellent.
When it comes to Norway, we put a lot of effort into prioritizing the Arctic, and we are investing heavily on the military side. We are now in process of getting our F-35s. We are getting new P-8s. We are investing in new submarines. We are putting a lot of effort in monitoring the area, keeping a good understanding. New Coast Guard vessels for the area around Svalbard and Barents Sea. So this is really important for Norway. Everything that is happening in the Arctic is in a way affecting Norway directly. So that is one of the highest priorities from the Norwegian side. Yeah.
Absolutely. Excellent. Any other questions? So looks like no. Oh, do we have one question there? Okay. All right. So I will give you all a break from answering the questions. I think we've had a tremendous panel here, and I think it really sets the stage for the next panel, because you all have done a phenomenal job at explaining the challenges of this very, very nuanced situation. And I think when we talked about deterrence, if that's even the right word, we have a lot of complicated factors to consider and how to approach the problem set in the Arctic region. But I think the good thing is, as we've learned, there are a lot of allies and partners here that are also looking at this. We're working at this together, and I think the cooperation amongst the Arctic 7 is as strong as it's ever been, and it's likely to get even stronger. And I think that's a refreshing perspective, and we'll look forward to hearing more from the second panel as to how they're actually looking at this from an operational perspective. But I want to thank you all for your tremendous remarks. Thank you.